Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Velero community meeting / open discussion. The date is April 28th. We are almost done with April. April went way faster than March. I think most of you will agree there. So we're almost done, but we do have one more community meeting here for Velero for this month. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through the status updates, and then we have a few discussion topics as well. And I'll start here. There we go. So for today's status updates, we'll start off with Steve.
Yeah, super quick update here. So I finalized the code for the backup progress PR, which I've been talking about for the last couple of meetings, and I'm going to do a demo of that in a few minutes, and that is ready for review from reviewers. Yesterday I fixed an issue a bug that we found. We've had a couple of reports of actually around included and excluded resources that are unresolvable through the Discovery API. So if you have a plugin that's supposed to run, like an item action that's supposed to run for a particular set of resources, but for some reason those set of resources don't exist in the cluster, there's a bug where potentially you end up with your plugin getting run for every resource type, which is definitely not desired behavior. So anyway, found a way to fix that and got that merged yesterday. It came up with our CSI testing, so that was kind of why it popped up. And then beyond that, just a bunch of reviews again on CSI stuff and looking at some of the CRD issues, which I'm sure Nolan will mention a little bit. And yeah, that's about all for me.
Awesome. Any questions, comments for Steve? All right, Stephanie, you want to give us an update on the 1.4 release?
Well, let's see. That request is actually for an update on the 1.4 release for Velero.
Yeah, I can jump in there. And so yesterday I went through the issues that we had in the backlog and tried to do some cleanup there to clarify where we are with everything. So I tagged everything that I think is essentially must have for the 1.4 release with the milestone. And I kicked everything else out of the milestone. So I can pull up a link if you give me a sec. Let's see. I'll paste it in the chat here. To the milestone in GitHub. So there are about 15 open issues that are still in there. We've got PRs open for, I'd say, at least half of them. So some are waiting on review or testing. But we do still have several CSI related issues open. We have a couple of CRD related issues. So, it feels to me like we may be ready to ship a beta sometime next week, but I don't think we're quite ready this week. We still got some work to get through.
That also doesn't capture anything in the plugins. That any work on any issues that are on the plugin repos.
Yeah, I just dumped a link to the CSI repo, which also has a 1.4 milestone. There are 2 issues in there as well. I think they're both bugs that came up in testing.
Cool.
So those issues have been, Steve, I think you marked them as long-term important. Do they still come for 1.4?
I mean, if we think we can't fix them for 1.4, we can have that discussion. And obviously the CSI plugin can evolve independently of Velero itself. So we could always continue to make fixes and changes and ship a new version of the CSI plugin without having to ship a full version of Velero. But I do think we should at least either look at these and say that we're not going to fix them for some reason, or we should try and fix them.
Yeah, I looked at them briefly, and I think we should definitely fix them. Yeah, let's see.
Okay. And then, yeah, just to cover our usual process, I mean, we usually ship at least one beta. So we'll get it out there once we're kind of feature complete, give everyone, including ourselves, a chance to test a known version. And then depending on kind of how the feedback goes there, if there are any major issues we need to remediate, we may ship a second beta, or if there are no major issues, it's just minor things, and then we'll typically go straight to GA. So that would kind of be the plan.
Awesome. Stephanie, did you have anything else to add there?
Thanks, Jonas.
All right, cool. Next up, we have Carlisia.
Hello. So I got the BSL done, the new controller for backup store location, and I'm adding tests to it, which is for me the hardest part. And I do have a discussion topic about a question that somebody is asking on that ticket. I did a tutorial for people who could use a very hands-on walkthrough of how to add code or change codes for the Velero code base. Yeah, that's it. That's me. It's pretty long, but it's very detailed. And I'm on community support this week. That's it for me.
Awesome. And this tutorial was also featured in this week's Kubernetes Weekly. So congrats, Carlisia, for being featured there. Really nice.
Thanks.
Yeah, we got 515 views, so people definitely are viewing it, and a bunch of likes. So that's good. We we talked about this. I think it's amazing to have these tutorials here to help new contributors on as well, and yeah, hoping to do more of these.
Yeah, if anybody watches it and has feedbacks, I'm sure I got at least one thing wrong. I could rectify or add documentation or do better next time. I'd appreciate feedback anyway.
Awesome. Any questions, comments for Carlisia? All right, Nolan.
I don't have a ton of updates. I was out sick late last week, and yesterday was mostly spent catching up, applying to stuff I'd missed. I need to get back to some changes Raphael made to PR 2373. I think that's the number for the backup format. Upgrades. Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, this one. So there was the last 2 weeks, I think we talked about like the backup backup format version number being changed to semantic versioning, and Raphael found that actually we use straight integer in our data, so that wouldn't work. So we needed to introduce a new field. So hopefully we can get this particular PR wrapped up and merged this week, hopefully sooner rather than later this week. I suspect, but don't know, that this will be the basis for a fix for our CRD v1 beta 1 and v1 conflict issues. But in the meantime, I'm also going to start working on an alternate path to see, just to compare those two approaches. And I know this will have merge conflicts with other PRs, so I'd like to get this in. There's a bunch of other reviews that I have going out there, but I don't recall them at this time. And just another reminder, this Thursday I will be on the Brett Fisher YouTube show. This will probably be a high-level introduction to Velero, but that will be at 1 p.m. Eastern this Thursday, and the link is there for when it goes live. So yeah, I think that's it for me. Oh, and I see Mark Campbell is on the call, and I know we didn't get to his topic 2 weeks ago, and he wasn't available last week. So I don't know if, Mark, you wanted to add your custom restore hooks item to the agenda this week.
Yeah, I'll add it right now.
Cool. That's it for me.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely send the link out here on Slack as well. So remind everyone, and of course out on Twitter, so everyone can watch. Yeah, follow along as Nolan is introducing Velero to the world again. So yeah, that's going to be super, super fun on Thursday there. Awesome. Thank you, Nolan. Any questions, comments for Nolan? All right, last up for the status updates, Ashish.
I don't have very many updates. I was in community support last week, getting through a bunch of PRs for the getting closer to ship CSI stuff. I think we have, as Steve mentioned, we have like 4 or 5-ish issues open that needs to be addressed. So I will be working on those. That's pretty much what I have going on. I don't have anything else. That's, yeah.
All right. Any questions for Ashish? Okay, then we're going to dive into the discussion topics. And since we didn't get to Mark's question last time you were on, I think it would be only fair to do that one first now. That's okay?
Sure. I just added it in there, so great.
Awesome.
We had opened up, this is like early still. A couple of months ago, we opened up an issue just to see if the Velero team would be open to some concepts around custom restore hooks to mirror the custom backup hooks. And there seemed to be a little bit of interest in the issue. A couple other people were interested in it. And so we gone ahead and submitted an early initial design proposal for how we could do that. That was just submitted last night, so I'm pretty sure nobody's had a chance to review it yet. Just wanted to kind of bring it up on here and see what we can do to, keep the conversation going and figure out how to get that implemented if everybody's up for it.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw this came in yesterday or last night, but definitely have not had a chance to look at it. But I'll certainly put it on my list to review. I think by the end of the week, I definitely should be able to read through it and put any initial comments on it.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, same. I think this is a gap that's really important because, like you said, Mark, we have the backup hooks, but we are missing, like, I'm seeing here, there's PG dump for Postgres, but there's no equivalent for PG restore. So that's good. That's a pretty big missing piece of the puzzle. So at a high level, I'm pretty on board with this. So
okay. A little kind of context and background. Well, we've implemented, we have a product here replicated called COTS that lets people ship third-party software to Kubernetes, and we've just finished a really deep integration to Velero. So love to show you guys that sometime too. And like a lot of UI around it, a lot of like total automation of Velero. It's like the preferred backup method. And so this just helps the restore process a little bit better in our products.
That is awesome. We would love to see a demo of that.
Great.
Yeah, just add it in.
Maybe feature. And
yeah,
maybe feature.
Sorry, go ahead, Ashish.
Yes, and maybe feature them on the adopters page.
Great. Yeah. I mean, we're just shipping the feature right now. So we'll keep joining, and as soon as we're ready to demo it, we'll definitely add it into the HackMD.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really cool.
Cool. That's it. So.
All right, awesome. So Steve, you're gonna look at this later in the week. Awesome. Next up, Steve, do you want to do a demo of the backup progress?
Yeah, this should be a quick one, but I'll share my screen. So if I can find my screen, too many windows. Okay, so yeah, so I've talked about this feature for the last couple of weeks, but you know, the main issue that we're trying to solve is that while a backup is running, there's not a lot of visibility to the user in terms of you know, how many items are going to be backed up, how many items have already been backed up. And so we wanted to make some changes to make it easier for a user to get a sense of what's going on within the backup. So I'm just going to kick off a backup here of my my cluster. Nothing special about the cluster other than I have a development image in here. So I'm just going to say Velero backup create demo, and then I'll back up the full cluster. And actually, before I kick that off, up here on the top, I'm going to just put a watch on, let's see, Velero describe demo on the describer. So we don't have it yet. So I'm going to kick off the backup now. And so if you look on the bottom here, we've got 2 new items in the describer. So the first line says number of items matching the spec. So basically the code has been changed. So what we first do is look at how many, we scrape items from the API server that match the backup spec. So that match the resource filters and the namespace filters, and we count how many of those there are. And then as we're backing them up, we're actually incrementing an additional field, which has already disappeared because the backup's completed, that shows how many items we've backed up so far. And so that'll increment as the backup's running. Once the backup's done, we simply show how many items were actually written to the backup tarball. So that's what you'll see when the backup is complete. So that's, I mean, that's essentially the UX for it through the describer. I can also show the YAML for it. So in the status section, we just have a new field called progress, and these names are certainly still up for debate. I'm trying to describe things as accurately as I can without making them too long. But so the first field we have is the items matching spec, which is how many things were scraped from the API server. The next field is items processed. So this is the one that we'll be incrementing as the backup is executing. So we're just counting how many items we've actually gone through and run plugins for and actually written to the plugin. And then at the end, we get an items backed up, which is the actual number of items that were written to the tarball. This number may be different from these other 2 numbers for a variety of reasons, which include things like backup item action plugins that include additional items, so that we're actually writing more items to the tarball than initially match the backup spec. Could be because there are exclude annotations on items such that we're not actually backing them up, and a couple of other reasons. But anyway, hopefully that kind of gives a sense of what's going on here. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I just have one question there. I see items processed is lower than items backed up. How does that work?
Yeah, so it's in this case, what's happening is that I also have the CSI snapshot code deployed. So what's happening is I said create a full backup of the cluster. We scraped everything from the API server, and there were 598 of those. We went through and processed all 598 of those. However, as part of backing up the PVC, in this case, we actually created a CSI volume snapshot custom resource and a volume snapshot content custom resource. And both of those got written into the tarball. So in this case, we actually wrote 2 more items to the tarball than we initially scraped from the API server because we created them as part of the backup. So that's kind of an illustrative example of why these numbers may not always match.
That makes sense. I think you mentioned something about that last week as well.
Yeah.
I am wondering, my head is not in that right now, but I'm wondering if we can reword any of these labels to make it clear that those numbers are not expected to match. I was going to say that, and then Jonas just re-emphasized because I think we're going to always get questions like this: why do I have more items backed up than matched the spec?
Yeah, I completely agree. That's one of the things I asked for feedback on. So please, yeah, if everyone can take a look at the PR and offer your input on how to name and word these things in a way that's clear without, you know, writing a paragraph for each field.
Yeah,
definitely appreciated.
But this is great.
I would
Steve,
also,
you also want, yeah, go ahead.
I would also say we can, the naming of these fields may be harder, but we can, if we use Velero backup describe, we can get more verbose. Like these fields on the data type might be tricky, but in Velero backup describe, granted, we can't necessarily do a watch on that easily, but if we do the output there for all of them, we can get a little bit more verbose and accurate. But I agree, it's tricky to document that. But.
Yeah, you will notice that while the backup was running, the describer was showing, you know, items matching the spec and items processed. And at the end of the backup, those two numbers are expected to match. But once the backup is completed, I'm just showing items backed up so that there's not really room for seeing those two different numbers and wondering why they differ. Like once the backup's completed, this is really the number that users would care about. But while it's running, you would want to see how many, you know, what number of the total has been processed so far. So
yeah,
tried to avoid confusion that way. But yeah, there's definitely room for improvement here.
Steve, did you have something in the logs showing that these two numbers are not going to match, or where it is expected to be, or it can be higher or something with the progress field?
Yeah, so let's see. So we're also writing all this information into the log. So I did, you know, the first log statement basically says this. So collected 598 items matching the spec from the API. And there's kind of a brief warning that the actual number of items backed up may be different. You know, I don't know if this will help or not. I don't know if folks will even see this, but it's at least there.
Just a quick comment. I think the idea of the number changing, you know, you see the 598 while you're watching it, and then at the end it suddenly disappears and this 600 shows. I think that actually might add to the confusion. I think if you leave somehow find a way to show both numbers with some text similar to what you have there explaining why they're different might be clearer than just because you look at the end and you say, wait a minute, I thought that was 598, and am I looking at the wrong file here? You know, that might begin to be confusing there. And also a quick question. I'm assuming then, for example, PVs, CRDs that get pulled in, those also are examples of what would push those numbers higher, because those wouldn't be in that initial number.
Yeah, that's right. You know, if you're not doing a full cluster backup, if you're just backing up a namespace, for example, then yeah, the PV would be, you know, wouldn't be identified in the initial scrape of the API server, but would end up being backed up as an additional item. So yeah.
I just had a couple ideas. I'll leave on the ticket.
Yeah, the other thing that I thought we might be able to do is like when we discover more items, we might just update the number of items matching spec and not call them items matching spec, but items to be backed up, maybe. I don't know. Yeah,
we can. I mean, I'm happy to consider all these ideas. It's definitely a little bit tricky to make perfect. And, you know, if you're constantly incrementing the total number, then, that has its own, its own confusion. So we can discuss some more on the PR, but yeah, I'm happy to modify things to whatever we think is the clearest.
Yeah, I think updating the total number, that seems consistent with other systems I've seen. I'm just I can't think of an example, but you're looking at progress of download, for example, and you find out in the middle of your download that it's actually bigger than you thought it was. Normally, we could see that updated in real time, and so you'd see, 3 of 200, 4 of 200, 4 of 201. I think that's fairly clear going on. Oh, okay, we have more than we thought we did. That's fine.
Yeah. We could definitely look at doing that. So if we just change that number as we go for additional items or things that get excluded due to annotations or any other item, things like that, then we just change the total number. That would be doable.
Yeah, like I've compared this to like the old Windows, well, even current Windows progress bars. Like as you're scanning a directory to do a file copy, right? As you recurse down, you may not have the full count of things, so that could change, and your speed for a file copy may change. So there's definitely comparisons that can be made to other systems. So we're certainly not the first to run into this kind of problem. So yeah, I think I would agree that updating the updating the total based on our plugins or annotations or excludes is a reasonable thing to do.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for the input, everyone, and definitely please do take a look at the PR and add any further comments you have there, and we'll figure out how to polish this up for release.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Next up, we have a question from Stephanie. Do you want to talk about the air-gapped environment?
Sure. So I was wondering if we can document a little more in detail how to execute the backup and recovery in an air-gapped environment. Just have a little discussion here on that. That's good.
Yeah, I see Nolan has added some links here as well. Do you want to talk about this, Nolan?
Yeah, so this is, so the link I added was basically a document saying, it's a very generic document because each time this has come up before, we've kind of struggled because there's a lot of different ways you could set up an air-gapped environment, and we can't document necessarily every single object store. So like the one we picked was Minio because we have examples for that, but we also can't document how to set up a production Minio because we can only extend ourselves so far. I know Michael had talked to Cloudian, I think was one of the vendors that had set up commercial support. There's also different on-prem plugins for volume snapshot support. So vSphere being one of them now. So the struggle has always been how do we capture it in such a way that's generic enough that we cover enough scenarios, but specific enough that it's useful. And I don't know if we've ever captured that balance well. The document I linked to is what we have now. I didn't link it to say that it's good necessarily, but it's what we have. So the two things that are really necessary are you have an object store with, again, that is compatible. Often it's something with an S3 compatible thing because those just happen to be, oh, my internet connection's unstable. Those just happen to be what are replicated. People just use the S3 API. And then you need something to capture volume snapshots with a plugin. So vSphere Ceph is a popular one. Portworx maybe. And then Velero should work as it does in a non-air-gapped environment. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks, Nolan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we can document it better, but I think it's tough.
Yeah, it's a matter of finding, like you said, the balance between being generic and then covering the high level specific use cases. Yeah, I'll take a look at the links. Thanks for posting them.
The other requirement for an air-gapped environment would be an image registry locally, which I don't think we cover because it's not strictly a requirement for, potentially you could, you could use one on the internet even if you're running on-prem, but that's another part of it.
Yeah, that would you would need to get Kubernetes up and running more or less.
And the Velero images.
Right.
Would it make sense to, from the documentation page there, would it make sense to link to documentation for on-prem providers that don't have separate plugins, but rather like Cloudian, for instance? Would it make sense to link to them and say, hey, here's a supported method?
That seems reasonable, yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be more like build your air-gap environment using these providers and back them up using Velero.
Yeah, because then they will keep their documentation up to date. So you would then present, here's how to work with Velero in an air-gapped environment, and here are the providers that have professional support or something like that.
Yeah, for folks doing a build your own, that makes sense. And then for folks doing something like an OpenShift or a TKG or some other like holistic solution, they're going to get it from that vendor, right? You're going to go to VMware to get the TKG package. You're going to go to Red Hat to get the OpenShift package. But if you're building your own, you're going to go to Cloudian for your object store. You're going to go to whomever is providing your PV storage for that. So yeah, I think linking out to Minio for one example, linking out to Cloudian for another. I think maybe building up a few more examples is a good idea.
There's a little bit of documentation in the Sonobuoy project about air-gapped installation and air-gapped running. Might be used taking a look at. I'll post the link in a second. I know there's a lot of things that are different in this case, but maybe it can be helpful.
So I would just say procedurally, Stephanie, do you want to file an issue just to make some improvements to this, and we can use that to track the work?
I will, Steve.
Perfect, thanks.
All right. The next item here, the last discussion topic of today is carlisias regarding crash looping.
Yeah, so we have we are going to be adding a new backup storage location controller that will modify the behavior for Velero. And one of the modifications is because to do anything with any backup, we need to have a storage location for that backup. So our thinking is, if there is no storage location, you can't create a backup. So the Velero should just crash loop in that case. If there is no storage location, or if there are, but they are all invalid, there is not a single one that's valid. We did that because it seems to be the pattern for Kubernetes applications. And the person who opened the ticket originally, actually a long time ago, that got this whole work going, he's in the call, and I want to ask him if he wants to jump in and describe the question that he had, just I think it was yesterday. Anthony, do you want to describe what your question was? Otherwise, I can do it.
Yeah, I can describe the scenario. So for one of the use cases we have is, when you deploy Velero, we actually don't create that default storage location. And this is because when you're running backups, we actually specify, we create a backup storage location, and then for every backup, we specify the storage location or the BSL that we want to run the backup against. So in terms of like this, the BSL liveness readiness probe. So since we deploy Velero without creating that default storage location, in this case, if the Velero pod will crash loop, if it finds there's no storage location, then it will be hard for example, external systems to know what is the cause of that crash loop. Is it because of there's no BSL, or could the crash loop be due to some error? Maybe the plugin, maybe there's a plugin error when installing Velero, or just some installation error that occurred during the deployment of Velero. So basically, the question I had is for the use cases where the user does not create a default storage location, if you could have Velero not go into a crash loop, so that, for external systems that track the status of the Velero pod, if a crash loop occurs, then the system will know for sure there's some issue with the Velero, and just basically to know for sure that the crash loop is not due to the BSL, but some other error condition.
I think I wanted to get input from Steve and Ashish. Nolan and I talked a little bit about this yesterday.
Yeah.
Do we?
And just to add, and I think if as a kubeadmin, it could be easy, as Nolan mentioned in the issue, that a kubeadmin could just look at the logs, and if they see that the crash loop is because there's no BSL, then it could be the user could easily know that, okay, I just need to create a BSL and then wait a few seconds, and Velero will be back up and running. But for like an external system that just relies on the pod status, then it could be hard to know for sure what the crash loop is.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add off the top of my head. I'll have to read through this again, and I can add any comments on the issue, but I don't have much to add right now.
Did you just say, Anthony, to modify the status so that you can know for sure why the crash loop is happening?
Pardon, I didn't get the first one.
I can answer that. So what he's saying, Tim, is not to crash loop. And instead of crash looping, log in an error, because you can look at the log.
I heard that, but so I was thinking while we were describing, we could, instead of having to look at logs or whatnot, we could set the status field. So a user could just interrogate the status and know for sure what's causing the crash loop.
We actually,
heuristic that Anthony described, but then I thought he said something. I thought you said something about status at the end, but that broke up a little bit.
So we iterated through these ideas, and so if we do go the route of logging an error, we also add a status that people can fetch. But I'm having a hard time judging which way is best, because if it's an anti-pattern for Kubernetes applications, meaning if the application is not in a ready state, it should crash loop. Maybe then, to be consistent, then maybe that's what we should do, to just crash loop the server. And you have to create a storage location before to bring it back up. Like that is the question that I don't know how to answer.
Well, forgive me for not knowing the answer to this question, but not having a default set, truly a not ready state, because Anthony described his use case, which is always specifying the backup storage location along with backup, which means there's a way to use the application without a default BSL. So I guess my question is crash loop even, does that even make sense in this case, since there are ways to use it?
That is a valid question.
Yeah.
Right, and just to like add more on the use case. So for us, you know, as I mentioned, we deploy Velero without a default storage location, but before we run any protection, we actually go first. We first create a you know, valid backup storage location, and then now we use that with the backup. So depending on what namespace you're backing up, we could specify each namespace could have its own backup storage location. And so we specify that in the backup spec. We just point to that storage location, and then, you know, Velero will take the backup of that namespace.
The other thing we were trying to do here was unify some of the behavior. So right now, Velero halts, the program halts when it doesn't have a default on startup. And if you, let's say you have a default on startup, it starts up, and then you delete all your backup storage locations. Velero will keep running. So we wanted to make sure that in both those cases, whether it was already running and you deleted all your backup storage locations, or you had no backup storage locations and you just started it, we wanted to make sure it behaved the same. Whatever that decision was, we wanted to make sure it behaved the same. The question that you had, Tim, about, well, there's a valid way to use it without, that is a great point. That if there's no default, we can just specify on each backup, hey, -- location, there's a way to use it without. Although, if there is a single backup storage location, then we assume that's the default. I think in Anthony's case, it's when there's 0 locations at all. Right, Anthony? Like, if I remember your system, it's at very first install, there's no locations, and then at first backup, a location will be created, and then the backup will happen, right?
Right.
Okay.
So that's like just-in-time creation, and I feel like we can perform the check at the beginning of a backup, right?
Lazily.
Like do it like lazily. I think that's one of the things that I think Steve mentioned in his comment.
I also wanted to answer Anthony's question on the issue. Anthony was asking about the liveness check, whether that would be exposed through a service or anything. Liveness checks, in my interpretation, I may be incorrect here, but liveness checks, from my understanding, are meant for the kubelet. So they're only exposed on the node, and it's for the kubelet to ask the program, hey, are you available and able to do stuff? So it's for the kubelet and Kubernetes to ask the program, are you ready to do things? So it would not be for an external system to do stuff with necessarily. But I suppose we could bubble it up through a service. I don't know if that's a pattern that other programs expose it into the cluster. I'm just not sure there, but my intention with it was just to use it with the kubelet. But we could also expose it through, if we plumbed it through to a service and said, hey, external services, hit this endpoint to ask Velero, are you ready to do stuff? That might be a solution.
So rolling back, is the intention of crash looping with no default to catch the common case where a backup is submitted either manually or through schedule with nothing specific specified in the backup request, and to catch it early. Okay.
Although I'm going back to something Carlisia mentioned to me yesterday. Carlisia, you were saying you wanted to have the user in your looking at your new command design. You wanted to have Velero get installed, then have the plugin installed, and then have the backup storage location created. Okay.
Yeah, my original thinking, but I am willing to defer to people who know the patterns of Kubernetes applications, you know, are more proficient at that than I am. So my original thinking was boot up Velero, then start creating things, add the plugin, add the backup location, and then you can create backups. So in that case, the server would be up. But like Tim just touched on it, you know, maybe the pattern should be just make it very clear Velero is not in a state to create backup, and that, you know, crash loop the server.
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer which one we should go with.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, go ahead, Nolan.
Well, that was kind of my intention with proposing the crash loop stuff. Like, it's very clear if you're crash looping, it's very clear it's not ready to do stuff. But as Anthony brings up, crash looping isn't necessarily without looking at Kubernetes events. It's not necessarily clear what the cause of crash looping is. So you'd have to look at kubectl describe to say, is it because it's an image pull back off? Is it because we don't have a plugin? Is it because we don't have BSL? Is it because of something else? So I think maybe we need to pause and say, what is the mechanism that we communicate the cause before we say, let's just crash loop on everything?
The other thing is, if we are going to, should we allow Velero to function without a BSL existing, or should we allow Velero to run, like not function but just run? Should we allow it to be alive?
That is the question.
Yeah, I think that's what Anthony's asking.
That basically captures the question. Yeah, because you know, yeah.
One thing that I also think is that if the server is crash looping, you will have to in your case, Anthony, you will have to find out why to then bring it back up, right? So if it's because of BSLs not existing, then you find out when you bring it back up. Would that not be a workable situation?
Right, it's just for us. So the system is like an external system, and so to do that, we have to just maybe like fetch all the storage locations within the Velero namespace, and then if you find there's none, then we'll basically need to assume that that's because Velero is crash looping because there's no BSL. But what if there's some other issue? Because for us, we also install plugin for the object store plugin, and the way we all this is automatically deployed via the system, and so once after we deploy, we check that the Velero pod status is up and running, so you can know that everything was installed and the plugin works. Yeah.
And I was thinking if we sent a Kubernetes event. These aren't super long lived, but if we sent a custom event that said Velero no BSL or something like that to communicate, we're crash looping because there are no BSLs. That would be, I think that's kind of akin to what Tim was saying with put a status, to give a clear indication that there are no BSLs. This is why we're crash looping. So you're not relying on just looking at a heuristic.
I'm starting to think is.
Yeah, you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were not done. Sorry, go on.
No, I just wanted to say, like, if you use the heuristic to say, oh, you're crash looping and we see there's 0 BSLs, that's not great, because just because there's 0 BSLs doesn't mean that's the same reason you're crash looping. It's a guess. But I'm starting to lean towards maybe we don't crash loop for no BSLs.
Well,
Yeah.
the lack of
Go
I'm
for
sorry,
it.
I was trying to add something. I feel like the lack of a default BSL, it's not a Velero problem, it's a backup problem. So the life cycle is different for this error. So what if the status of the Velero pod, I'm going back to status, that's used pretty heavily in Contour, I think to good effect. Anyway, if you can interrogate the Velero pod or pods to basically enumerate the list of backups that couldn't start up because they're missing something. Because it's not that Velero is broken, it's that these backups individually, or these scheduled backups or whatever, don't have all of their prerequisites. It's really stretching the metaphor, but to me, this is like the difference between compile time and runtime.
Yeah, I'm starting to question whether crash looping is the right thing to do here, because usually like the controllers are for like long-lived objects in Kubernetes, where you have like a config and you have the controller working to, or you have a spec and then you have the controller trying to reconcile the spec to status. But in the case of backup storage locations, it doesn't have to be long-lived. It can be like, you can have like short-lived backup storage locations that are valid just for this backup. So maybe we can just, at the beginning of the backup, we can verify whether, do I have a backup storage location where I can store this backup in? And if there is no backup storage location that you can use for this backup, you update the status of the backup object and just exit and fail the backup.
So we would have will we have a controller for BSL or no? To keep updating
in the scenario that I just described, we wouldn't have a controller. If you think about, like, I know we don't have multi-tenancy right now, but in the future when we decide to have multi-tenancy, it may be possible that some user in some tenant in the multi-tenant world may have a invalid backup storage location, or a backup storage location that they can't use. At that point, they will either crash the whole Velero installation, or they will, I don't know how that scenario would go.
I think that's a really good point to paint the difference between what's needed for a backup versus what's needed for Velero itself.
I mean, we definitely talked about that very early on in this discussion, like just, having the backup fail validation, or just fail if its BSL doesn't exist or is not valid. And we discarded it because we didn't want to wait that late to provide that validation to the user. But I did want to ask Anthony, I mean, if the approach we take is don't do any validation until we try to run a backup, and only when we run a backup check if the BSL exists and is, can be connected to, does that meet your needs?
Right. Yeah. I think that should meet our needs, because once we run the backup, we check we describe the backup. So if there's some error with the backup, we should be able to pick it up from the backup status. Right. It's just when we deploy Velero, we don't configure that default BSL, and so if you're crash looping, it makes it hard to really know what the crash loop is if there's some other error condition.
Yeah, and a lot of the current behavior is geared towards letting users who are sitting at the keyboard know really early on if they need to change something before they go to do a backup. So that's why those decisions were made. That's kind of why Steve mentioned that's why we discarded them, because it's super late. But like I get the I totally get what Ashish is saying, like and what Ashish and Tim are saying. Like it's the actual concern is at backup time. The reason the decision was made was because we wanted to say, hey, person installing Velero, maybe you want to install a backup storage location now while you're doing the whole setup versus, hey, I set a schedule and walked away, and then you come back who knows when, and just your backups weren't running. But in Anthony's case, it's different.
So this is my understanding. I think we are in the consensus here. We are not going to have a controller for BSL. We are going to change the behavior of Velero to not check for BSL. We're not going to crash loop anything. We are going to just add a validation to the backup process to check. I think we might already have that, I don't know, to check if there is a corresponding BSL or not. And there's no such thing, we're not going to be able to add a status, like if Velero is in the right status or states or not. So there will be no status.
I don't think we necessarily need to discard the BSL controller. Like there may still be room for having it. If a user does create a BSL at the start and doesn't run a backup for quite some time, it would still be nice to be able to kind of asynchronously, periodically check that it can be connected to and have some indication of status. But then we'd want to make sure that when we run a backup, we're probably retrying that check. So, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I wouldn't necessarily discard the idea of the controller just because we're going to do the validation at backup time.
Okay, so, and then I like that too. So in that case, we do add the status, like a state to the status request. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
I'll summarize this in the issue.
Sounds good. Awesome discussion.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks a lot, Anthony.
Okay, thanks, Carlisia. Thanks, guys.
Just last thing here before we cut off, the contributor shoutouts. Steve, do you want to do those? I can share my screen again.
Yeah. And I just grabbed from Velero Core and the plugin repo. So these were both from Velero Core. So Raghavendra, who got a PR in to help clarify some of the wording in the Velero restore describe command around what included namespaces mean. So this is because on a restore, if you're including all namespaces, it really means all namespaces that are in the backup. So we got some clarification there. So that's really helpful for users who are looking at that. Thank you. And then Mayank also got a PR in to basically skip any validation of volume snapshot locations for backups when snapshots are explicitly disabled. So this would be a use case where you're maybe just don't want snapshots, or you're using RESTStick to back up your volumes. And so we just want to ignore the state of the volume snapshot locations. So that's definitely another usability enhancement that's going to make things a little bit easier. So thanks a lot, Mayank.
Awesome. And with that, thank you everyone for joining. It's been an awesome meeting as always. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Have a great week, everyone. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.